surplus and federal deficit are. When the government runs a deficit, it means that it has spent more than it has collected in tax revenue in a given year. When the government runs a surplus, it means it's taken more in revenue than it's spent in a given year. So these annual deficits and surpluses accumulate to what's known as the national debt. Now, despite all the fear-mongering around the national debt and putting our bills on the credit card and the Chinese on the debt and all this fear-mongering, what the national debt is and what MMT proves to us is that it's really just the money that the government has created, and that can take a few different forms, but it's the money that the government has created that is now in the economy that has not been taxed out of existence. So if you think of spending as creating new money and taxing as deleting the money, the debt is just the money that's been created that has not been destroyed yet. Okay, another key MMT framework, or a key framework that MMT draws upon, is Wynne Godley's sectoral balances. So this graph shows the US sectoral balances. It's split up into 3 sectors: the private sector, the government sector, and the foreign sector. So according to Godley's sectoral balances, all these sectors must sum to 0, meaning if the government spends $1 in the economy, that is $1 surplus in the private sector and $1 deficit for the public sector. In the case of the United States, we run a persistent trade deficit because we buy more goods from the rest of the world than we sell to the rest of the world. Because the US runs a trade deficit, it's important for the federal government to run a deficit as well in order to maintain the private sector's surplus of financial assets. So if you look at the graph, you can see that the government sector and the private sector are mirror images of each other. Now, if you look in late 90s, where you can see the Clinton surplus is when the government goes into surplus, the private sector simultaneously went into deficit, and that means a buildup of private debt, which is not a good thing. MMT argues that actually led to the financial crisis. So the private sector deficit is something we want to avoid. Okay. Next slide, Jim. Thank you. So often when a policy is proposed, people will ask, how are we going to pay for it? This can be of new spending programs or of tax cuts. For example, let's say the federal government wants to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. How are we going to pay for it? Where is that money coming from? MMT explains the answer, and it is pretty simple. Congress just approves of the spending. The Treasury instructs the Federal Reserve, which is the government's bank, to credit the bank accounts of the individuals and corporations that the government is buying goods and services from. The government spends with a keyboard and taxes with the keyboard by marking account balances up and down. All spending and taxation is just crediting and debiting bank accounts. So a good analogy, a good way to think about this, and you'll hear a lot of the MMT academics explain it this way, is a scoreboard. So if I'm at a hockey game and a team scores a goal, the scorekeeper marks up one goal for the Rangers, and that goal didn't come from anywhere. It's just marked up on the scoreboard. So this part is pretty simple. The harder questions are, do we have enough real resources for whatever policy goal it is we're proposing? If we're doing infrastructure, are there enough engineers, construction workers, and concrete to pull off this policy? Will this policy drive up new prices? MMT tells us that these are the questions we should focus on when thinking about public policy, not about finding the money somewhere. Similarly, when interest on a government bond comes due, the government just credits the account of the bank, of the holder. There's no need to tax future generations or anything like that. It does this hundreds of times a day. So currency issuers, like the federal government, do not require revenue from taxes or bond issuance in order to spend money. Government spending always comes first, taxing and bond sales come second. Where else would the money come from in order to buy the bonds? So why does the government bother to tax at all? As I said earlier, taxes drive money. They give the currency value, and they can also be used to dampen inflation, should it occur. Jim, can you go next? Thanks. So MMT also places a lot of emphasis on monetary sovereignty. So the United States is an example of a country that is monetarily sovereign. US, UK, Canada, and Australia are all monetarily sovereign, meaning they control their own currency. Cities and other governments, other national governments are not sovereign because they don't necessarily control their currency. So France, for example, their currency is controlled by the European Central Bank. The French government can't issue its own currency. So unlike the United States, if the French government wants to do something, it does indeed have to find the money first by either taxing its citizens or borrowing from its citizens. Same with the city of Detroit. It's not the story, this is not the case for the federal government. Another point of focus for MMT is whether or not a country has a fixed or floating exchange rate. So in the United States, for example, our currency used to be exchangeable for gold, meaning I could take $35 to a bank and get an ounce of gold for it. Roosevelt suspended the gold standard during the Great Depression in order to fight the Great Depression and also fund World War II. So this is a comic I like a lot, or a little cartoon from that era. If you can see, that's the American dollar, and there's Roosevelt sawing off the chains, the gold standard, so he can go fight the Depression. Nixon then eliminated international convertibility in 1971, which was kind of like the last vestige of the gold standard. And it's important to understand that when a currency is fixed versus floating, there are much different sets of fiscal policy rules that you have to follow. A lot of textbook economics still treat the US dollar as if it were on a gold standard, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. Okay, Jim, thanks. So what does this all mean, and why is this important? Why do I care about this? First of all, the federal government can't run out of money. Politicians will say this all the time, we're out of money, we're broke. Not true. The federal government can always buy what's for sale in its own currency, and it doesn't need our money to do that. It does this simply by crediting bank accounts. The national debt, which is another thing that is kind of like a political football, it's literally just the private sector's net savings. It's the net US dollar financial assets that the government has created. Even though, and this is a lot of, you'll hear a lot of this criticism in the media lately, even though MMT is saying that there's no solvency constraint for the government, it's not saying that deficits don't matter. It's not saying that we can spend money infinitely. It is saying that fiscal policy decisions, so decisions about spending and taxing on the federal level, should be made based on real resources and not just dollar costs or some kind of balanced budget sentiment. And I think the really important point here, and this is what Stephanie Kelton says, the government has to balance the economy, not the budget. So this means aiming for sufficiently high aggregate demand in order to reach and maintain full employment. If you look at what happened after the financial crisis, both sides were really fear-mongering about the national debt thing. The government was afraid to stimulate the economy. The stimulus ended up being much smaller than a lot of economists, especially the MMT economists, were calling for. And the recovery from the crisis took a lot longer than it could have. And this is people's livelihoods, this is unemployment, this is people living and dying a lot of times. And it's important, again, like I said, to balance the economy, not the budget. So my friend Jim is now going to further discuss the political implications of MMT, and thank you guys for listening.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Henry George School, for inviting us here today. On April 9th of this year, a group of 27 Democratic members of the House of Representatives, known as the Blue Dog Coalition, issued a call for an amendment to the United States Constitution mandating a balanced budget for the federal government. The Blue Dogs press release stated, "Today, the national debt is $22 trillion, an unprecedented level, and never in modern history has the U.S. annual budget deficit been so high outside of war or economic recession. February this year was marked to be the largest monthly budget deficit on record, higher than at any point during the 2008 global financial crisis when the economy was in peril and the Tea Party took to the streets." Congressman Correa of California, the Blue Dogs co-chair for communications, added, "Washington needs to have a serious, bipartisan discussion about our nation's fiscal state. Republicans and Democrats need to come together now to make tough decisions. And the Balanced Budget Amendment is a step in the right direction to putting our nation on a fiscally sustainable path. If we don't address these problems, every single American will face serious economic repercussions. And Utah Congressman Ben Adams, he's the author of the Blue Dogs Balanced Budget Constitutional Amendment proposal. In congressional testimony on March 9th of this year, he stated, "Every Utah family understands that when you decide to make a purchase, you must first show how you'll pay for it. Either you find additional revenue, or you cut back on spending elsewhere so that you continue to live within your budget." This is what hard-working Utah families do every day when they sit around the kitchen table and balance their checkbooks, and we must do the same. The belief that the federal government's budget is the same type of thing as an individual household's budget is what we call the household budget analogy. The analogy goes like this. An individual household has to bring in income before it can engage in spending. So too must the federal government bring in income before it can spend. An individual household has to live within its means. So too must the government follow the principles of sound finance. If its spending exceeds its revenue, the national debt will grow and eventually lead to some combination of inflation, people refusing to buy government bonds, and bankruptcy. Hence, any new government spending must be preceded by identifying new revenue sources that will pay for that spending. Do you want Medicare for all or the Green New Deal? The first question to be asked is, how are you going to pay for it? It's not just the Blue Dogs who believe in the household budget analogy and who bow down to the virtue of the balanced budget. Proclaiming the virtue of the balanced budget is not held simply by a small wing of the House Democrats. It's been a bipartisan ritual for at least the past 40 years. Let's go to the video.
Taking money from our children and borrowing from China.
Take out a credit card from the Bank of China in the name of our children, driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay back. That's irresponsible. It's unpatriotic.
The government's irresponsible spending is turning us into slaves. You might well literally lock us into chains, at least our children.
We got to deal with this big long-term debt problem, or it will deal with us.
And it is I'm asking you, join us to stop this fiscal train wreck. Join us to protect our children from an inferior standard of living, from a crushing burden of debt and taxes.
Okay, I don't believe in any of the tax cuts. I didn't want taxes words. I didn't even want them for the middle class. Okay, because you know why? Because it puts a $400 billion hole in the budget and we just can't afford it.
And as we discuss deficit reduction, which is clearly a major issue.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future.
The deficit thing is real and the debt thing is real. We are really in trouble, and it's something.
Is there a need for comprehensive deficit reduction? The answer is not only yes, but hell yes.
This debt that hangs over our head, a government that spends more money than it takes in, that's not sustainable.
You cannot cut taxes or increase spending unless you can pay for it.
The math of federal spending does not add up. And we're spending money we do not have.
A debt burden that's crushing us.
To me, this is more of a moral issue. You can't steal from your kids and grandkids.
Deficit. We think the deficit and the national debt
or at a moral level.
National debt is America's biggest problem.
Okay, so we hear all the time that Washington can't.
So that video excerpt was from a talk by Stephanie Kelton, the Angry Birds talk. You'll find a reference on the handout sheet, and the video itself was compiled by one of Stephanie's students. So we are here today to tell you that the household budget analogy is incorrect. It's bad economics, bad public policy. The school of political economy known as modern monetary theory helps us to see why and points out a better way forward. But before we go forward, let's go back to the 1940s, to the time of the Second World War. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Hitler has declared war on the United States. The war is obviously going to be an expensive proposition. Did anyone say, we have to raise the taxes and wait for them to be collected before we can spend the money needed to send the troops into battle? No. Oh, sorry. Did anyone say, we better make sure that we don't spend so much on the war that we fail to balance the budget? No. Did anyone say, we can't afford this war because we just don't have the money? No. Let me see.
They sold bombs, though.
Okay. So, how did we pay for the war? Ultimately, the explanation boils down to something like this. The federal government had the authority to create money. Since starting to go off the gold standard in the 1930s, the dollar has been a fiat currency created by government spending into the economy. And that's what the government did during the war, big time. At the start of the war, the economy had yet to fully recover from the Great Depression. There was still large-scale unemployment and unused industrial capacity. As that capacity became converted to war production, civilian production of goods, such as automobiles, was halted. The wages of service members and defense workers constituted new spending power. That would have been severely inflationary, so the government drained that spending power from the economy through higher taxes, facilitated by the introduction of withholding, and through sales of war bonds. The government thereby reclaimed the money that it had spent into the economy. This led economist Abba Lerner to formulate his theory of functional finance. The level of federal spending and taxation should be set not at a balanced budget equality to satisfy the dogma of sound finance, but at a level that fully utilizes the labor and real resources available for purchase in the currency the government is issuing. Now, let's fast forward 40 years to the 1980s. A political dynamic developed in which the Republicans would accuse the Democrats of being the party of tax and spend. The Democrats would get defensive. They'd try to out-fiscally responsible the Republicans and join calls for balanced budgets, perhaps to be enforced by constitutional amendment. When Democrats occupied the White House, Republicans would weaponize calls for balanced budgets against the Democrats. When Republicans occupied the White House, their calls for balanced budgets would quickly ebb in volume. The result was that over time, the Democrats came to be fighting with both hands tied behind their backs, believing that they must always show themselves to be fiscally responsible. They found themselves by agreeing to pay-go rules, which required new spending to be matched by new tax revenues or spending cuts. So, when we say that we want Medicare for all, or the Green New Deal, the first response of most Democrats in Congress not just the Blue Dogs, but Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and even many of the Progressive Caucus, is to say how you're going to pay for it. We can't do that because that will blow the deficit sky high. Now, in contrast, modern monetary theory argues that the fact that the US government is the monopoly issue of dollars gives us much larger fiscal space to spend on the public purpose and tax for the public purpose as well. MMT broadens our political discourse. The conversation does not have to stop at how you're going to pay for it. We can consider policy recommendations such as the job guarantee. As MMT leader Bill Mitchell put it just 2 weeks ago, what an understanding of MMT would generate is a new awareness among the voting public, which would force the political elites of any persuasion to construct the political narrative in a more open way, stripped of the lies derived from an application of sound finance. Thank you very much.
Is it possible that we're not able to get her slides on this computer? We'll try this in yours?
You have PowerPoint first.
Yeah.
I don't have PowerPoint.
Well, you don't have PowerPoint, okay.
Are those slides on the web?
PDFs. Then they can go work anytime. Yeah, if we can keep it brief, I think that's a good idea. Meanwhile, we're not ready to get our slides.
Do you have Office LibreOffice on your?
Yeah.
Yes, LibreOffice. This is LibreOffice.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, let's try that.
Let's see if I can do the loads first.
So, I'd like to start with just brief questions. Please keep your longer comments for after Sue and Dan have spoken. But if you have a real question to one of our two great speakers here.
I would say a real question is one where you just don't
Dan?
understand what they meant.
Question is what?
A question, I would say the questions you want to ask now are where you just didn't understand what they meant, rather than you don't.
Yeah.
I guess what he means is just clarification question.
Clarification question.
You know, if it's a why question, we can deal with it at the end, because Sue and I might have answered that before you ask it. But if it's a question where
the connection is.
Yeah, you're breaking up, Dan, but I think that's a good way to put it. Okay.
Let's go.
Yeah. So clarification questions. Everybody followed everything they said. Don't have a question of what they meant by something. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I came late. I missed about half an hour. I missed the first speaker.
Okay.
So I'm really apologizing for that because I have problems with the L train. It was just a mess.
Well, you want to give a 1 minute recap of what you said?
I just wanted to ask, I'm trying to understand, what's the definition of money?
Yep.
And you mentioned fiat currency, and you talked about how the war was financed, and I thought it was financed with war bonds and credit. And I guess that's what you meant, and it would be paid back later, I suppose, when you bill everyone for the services that you provided. In such cases, I think we supplied England and France with weapons and soldiers and whatever, and we had to get paid back for that.
Yep.
But I really could never understand what money is.
Okay.
I mean, the change in my pocket, the dollar bills, the worthless. Now there's this rise of cryptocurrencies.
Yep. Good question.
And Bitcoin is like
Right.
$5,800 now.
Yeah.
And just a month ago it was 3,000 something.
Right.
This is all very strange and foreign to me, and I'm thinking that we're in trouble, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, I actually got interested in MMT because I was very interested in cryptocurrency first, and that's how I found MMT. So the MMT definition of money is when it's called chartalism. There's a school of chartalism. It's called CHARTALISM, chartalism. And the thinking is that there's a state authority places a tax on a population. That tax is only payable in the currency the government issues, and that's why the dollar is our primary currency. Now there are secondary currencies like Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is not money because there's no issuer that gives it a face value. So one Bitcoin might be worth $10,000, might be worth $2,000 because there's no authority that accepts it as receipt, guaranteed. The US dollar, $1 is always $1, and that can always cancel $1 of tax liabilities. And that's, according to MMT, that's what gives money its value.
So to try to understand, since I grew up in the age of the dollar being backed by gold at some point, Mr. Nixon changed that around. So the United States created more debt for itself because it's no longer giving away gold. And yet today I still hear in the news that countries like China and India and even Russia are accumulating gold. I don't know if any of this is true or if it's like Mr. Trump says, fake news. I don't know what's real and what's not. And I can never understand why gold is even attached to the monetary system, even today as people think about it, because it really should be just a commodity like silver or copper and used for other purposes other than dollars. The strength of the dollar is what I don't understand. Is it going to get weaker in the future and then it's going to be more inflationary here because of that? Explain to me where our future lies.
I wish I could tell you where the future lies. I don't know if I can't answer that, but gold, I think, gold is similar to Bitcoin. It's a commodity and it's worth what the market will pay for it.
Well, in that respect, then gold is also similar to a painting, like a Picasso work of art, same thing?
Yes. Yeah. And I think, should we move on?
I guess Sue's presentation is going to clarify some of the questions that he asked.
No more questions?
I'd also like to go, there's a question about more the topics that we're going to have. Are we going to talk more about foreign, because I know racking up a huge deficit has foreign exchange rate agents. If you want to have you can make your currency weaker, to have some effects, you want more trade to come in, you want more tourism or whatever. Is that also going to be covered, or?
I guess we can probably do that at the end. That's probably the time for it.
So yeah, some of these questions can engender quite a lengthy discussion, and we have two other speakers.
I understand.
We have plenty of time.
And we will be answering those questions before you ask them.
I'm just wondering how deep we're going to get into some of these things.
All right, well, let's hear from Sue and Dan, and then we'll have the clarification questions, then we'll go into wider discussion of some of these bigger questions.
Okay, I'm ready. So let me warn you first, I walk around a lot. I never talk to an audience of people. So, I'm from the American Monetary Institute, the Alliance for Just Money, which is a new organization that was formed this year, coming out of the AMI, more of an activist group. And I'm also in the Green Party of the US, which on its national platform has Dennis Kucinich's NEAT Act, which is Public Money Monetary Reform. And we recently created a National Standing Committee on Banking and Monetary Reform to defend that platform. Okay, next. So I'm gonna just, wait, okay, so I want us all to think. Hard for me sometimes to think, but think about money, which we haven't been taught much about. We know we need it, we have to get a job, and we need the money to get our needs met, but who creates the money? Where does it come from? We're never taught that. Next. So what is the definition of government? Now, these slides have the AMI answer and the MMT answer as best as I can put them together. Okay, so When I talk about government, I talk about the national government in relation to creating money. So I talk about Congress and the executive branch with the treasury. That's our national money person. Okay. Now, MMT, as you heard, talks about the public sector. And they can correct me, but they include under government Congress, the executive branch, Treasury, the Federal Reserve banks, and other state bodies. So it's different definition of government. Okay, next. What about the Federal Reserve System? Okay, next. Is the Federal Reserve System privately controlled? That's what I say, based on my experience and my study. Or is it part of our government, which is what MMT says, which I don't agree with? Next. I handed out this report. I had a friend, he was able to get this report from the New York Fed in 2006. I can't get an updated version, they ignore me. But he got it. And it gives you all of the 120 some odd commercial banks that are members of the Fed, New York Fed Bank, which is the powerful bank of the Federal Reserve System. I was very surprised when my friend sent me this report. I was shocked, actually, because what it shows is, and first go to the second page, page 2. The pages might not be in order. JP Morgan Chase, we all heard that. It owns 50% of the shares of the New York Fed Bank. All the shares of the New York Fed Bank are owned by these commercial banks. Our government doesn't own one. None of us can buy a share. Chase has 50% of the shares, and it has $61 billion of capital. This was 2006, probably more now. Now go back a page. Then the next thing, I was adding these figures up, I was like, Citibank, back in 2006, it had 17 million shares, which was 23% ownership of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. That's a powerful amount. The rest of the ownership, the rest of the shares, is divided among all this 120 odd banks. So I say the New York Federal Reserve System is privately controlled. Next. That's just the total 121 member banks own all the shares. Next. Private commercial banks. Can you write it down so you know? Private commercial banks. These are the banks that most of them are members of the Federal Reserve System. They're the banks that you walk into, you put your checking account in, you write your checks, pay your bills. You want a loan, you walk into a private commercial bank. Next. What is the role of these banks? I say they have the power to create what we use as money. The banks, private corporations called banks, chartered by states and federal governments, have the right to create money. They're private. And they decide who gets it. Because they create money whenever they make a loan to anybody that's created money. And they create money when they buy securities. There's a whole group of 20 big primary banks, commercial banks, that have a special status at the New York Fed. They're called primary dealer banks. You have to try hard to get on that list, like TD, Chase, Citibank, name the big ones. They have the power, as any bank has, but they work at the Fed. They have the power, when they buy securities, they create money to buy those securities. Awesome power. And these are the primary dealer banks that when the Treasury auctions out bonds, those are the banks that buy them by creating money. Powerful. Now, MMT doesn't really talk about that. They talk a lot about the government. Great, but who's creating the money we all use are the private commercial banks. Next, who creates money in private commercial banks? Buying securities or making loans versus our government paying its expenses. Next, who owns the biggest pile of U.S. national debt? We have 22 trillion. I did an analysis a couple years ago, spent a couple days on it, everybody who owns our national debt, which is the group that has the biggest pile? Banks and financial institutions. I was shocked because the media says China, isn't that? No. Banks and financial institutions, especially the Federal Reserve banks. Versus the national debt, MMT says the national debt is really private financial assets because they're bonds in retirement accounts and financial institutions. And it's not really debt, it's not a problem. I think it's a problem. Next. If it's true that the government creates the money to fund its expenses, as MMT says, and does not use taxes or bond sales to fund its expenses, why originate bonds at all and why levy taxes at all? Next. Who creates money for financial markets? Our economy has been financialized. The real economy hasn't been getting much money, but the stock market, the derivatives market, the bond market, the currency market, they get a lot of money. Billions of dollars are flowing around those markets every day. So who creates that money? Private commercial banks. Versus MMT doesn't really talk about it. Next. This is Graham Towers, governor of the Bank of Canada, and he was asked by his opponent, there's no question about it, the banks create the medium of exchange. Towers said, that's right, that is what they are for. That is the banking business. Just in the way that a steel plant makes steel, commercial bank creates the money we use. Next. Here's the president of the Bank of England in the 1920s, the second richest man in Britain. But if you want to continue to be slaves of the banks and pay the cost of your own slavery, then let bankers continue to create money and control credit. And that's what they've done today. And that's why we've had the problems today we have. And they don't teach us this. They don't want to. That we take their power away if the American public knew this. Next, corporate power. We're all fighting corporate power, right? Next, who empowers multinational corporations? Who does that? I say private commercial banks who have that power to create money, versus MMT doesn't really talk about it. Next. Okay, I met this woman, Jean Gillette, about a few years ago. She spent 10 years working for the largest French bank, multinational bank in New York City. She said, as I saw with my own eyes in 10 years at the bank, the largest corporations are topped off, even underwater in debt, and utterly dependent on the next loan. The banks won't let them go under. They would have to write off billions in losses, so they just restructure the loans and give them another loan. Now, she also said to me, and I was amazed, the whole 10 years she was there was not one loan given by that multinational bank less than $1 billion. And they're giving them out to these multinational corporations around the world. That's what's fueling this corporate attack on our rights. Next. And I handed this out. You can see, this is, who's banking against the Sioux? You know, the pipelines that the Indians have been stopping, right? Who's funding the companies, those pipeline companies? That'll show you, and I indicated all the banks that are the New York Federal Reserve member banks, tells you exactly how much loans they are giving those pipeline companies, creating money when they make those loans. This is very important. Next. How did we get here? Next. In world history, what used to be money? Money is not debt. Money is not a bond sitting in your account, in your retirement account. It is debt-free creation by a government. It's not debt, it circulates. It doesn't disappear, it circulates around, and people use it to get their needs met. That's what money is needed for society. People need it to get those goods and services that they can't make. And MMT will talk about the history next. From the remotest, this is Alexander Delors, a historian, a monetary historian, right? From the remotest time to the 17th century of our era, the right to coin money and regulate its value by giving it denomination, that right, and the right of limiting or increasing its quantity was the prerogative of the state. The king, they said, this is going to be money, and we're going to issue it, and it'll circulate. It's not debt. You need it. Citizens need it to get the goods and services to live. And you can see this is all the details of all the public money. Notice 1666 English free coinage and the Bank of England. Bank of England, that was the beginning of what we have as the Fed. Okay? That's privately controlled money. But up to that point, the governments control the issuance of money. Now we have privately created money from private corporations called banks. Next. What about U.S. money history? And I'll go through this fast because I am taking time. Next. Okay. We have a great history of publicly issued debt-free money. Great history. I was shocked to learn in the colonies, all 13 colonies, the colonists wouldn't let private banks into the colonies. There's banks all over New York City. And I studied that and I said, you're kidding me. Because they knew what happens when you give the power to create money to private banks and take it away from the government. So they kept the power to create money in their colonial legislatures. And all 13 of them issued what they called bills of credit. There was paper money, they were in debt, and they circulated. And Benjamin Franklin, he was intimately connected with Pennsylvania's decision to issue publicly created money from their colonial legislature. And he said the reason we had our American Revolution was that back in Britain, the Board of Trade and the Parliament passed laws that said, oh no, the colonies can't issue anymore debt-free money publicly issued. No. And they tried to take that away from the colonies, and that is what Benjamin Franklin said. That was the real cause of the American Revolution. Next. Orders were sent to America to put down the colonial money. It was the enforcement of this policy that brought on the revolution. Next. Here, this man is great historian, wrote many books, all about money. Studied it. The battle over the control of money has raged for millennia. This is not our battle. This has been going on throughout the history of creating societies that use money, right? That's how a society has to have money. And it's publicly controlled versus private control. Never was a great historical event followed by a more feeble sequel. A nation rises to claim for itself liberty and sovereignty. It gains both of these ends by an immense sacrifice of blood and treasure. That was our Revolutionary War. Then, when victory is gained and secured, it hands the national credit, that is to say, a national treasure, over to private individuals. Because as soon as the revolution was over, private banks came in to the new nation. 1781, the first charter given by a newly created state to a private bank. And Alexander Hamilton was involved in that from the beginning. Next. Oh, you can't really see it, but this is William Pitt, the first British Earl. Let the Americans adopt their funding system and go into their banking institutions. See, they knew, because the Bank of England had been active since 1694 in England, so they knew who was running the show in England. And their boasted independence will be a mere phantom. Next. And here's Alexander Hamilton. He knew the English system of private creation of money. He knew it. And he says, for the simplest and most precise idea of a bank, he's talking about private banks, is a deposit of coin or other property as a fund for circulating a credit. That's the creation of what is used for money as debt, right? Circulating a credit upon it, which is to answer the purpose of money. He knew all about it. He was instrumental in encouraging banks to come in and getting laws passed. Next. And this is just to say, this struggle went on. We had state-chartered banks coming in. You can see from 1791 to 1837, the increase in a number of private state-chartered banks creating money. I mean, they, a lot of them would say, well, we have gold and silver here, and we're, creating our paper money, so it's okay. Some of them didn't even have the gold and silver. Next. When the Constitution was fresh, 1787, people were familiar with colonial or state bills of credit, state government money issued directly, debt-free, and with private banknotes, because they started seeing the private banknotes circulating, right? The banks came in. But 20 more years later, as circulating banknotes came to provide a volume of currency which before could not have been imagined, because the banks flooded into the new nation, and just the number of banknotes was, increasing and increasing. The fact that the notes were money became obvious, and its unexpected implications began to emerge. There were problems, there were struggles at a national level in this country, from the beginning of the country all the way through the Federal Reserve, and that was a big struggle. And then the public discourse about what money is was slowly removed from our public discourse. Next. What about the U.S. Greenback? Next. The banking business. Okay, next. I'll show you what. The Greenback, we all hear about the Greenback because Lincoln issued it. He got support of Congress. They passed the law. They issued it. It was direct from the Treasury of the United States, no central banks or anything. Right from the Treasury, it was issued. They issued $400 million. They didn't overissue what was authorized by the Congress. Our government history of publicly issued money direct from its treasury has never been overissued. It's never done that. What's been overissued is the banks creating loans and creating bubbles in real estate, bubbles in stock markets. That's what's been overissued. But the banks will blame our government. They don't want you to know this history. They will blame our government, so you don't think, well, listen, we all need the government. We got to change it so it's working for us. If we don't do that, we don't have a government. Next. What is the Fed? Next. It's commercial banks owning shares, right, in their Federal Reserve Bank. They control it. What's gone wrong? This system of privately created money out of debt has created an obscene concentration of wealth. around the world. Obscene. Horrible. It's a system. We have it. We have to get rid of it. We have to change it. Next. What can we do? Here we go. What can we do? In 2010 and 2011, Representative Dennis Kucinich entered into Congress the NEED Act, H.R. 2990, based on the work of the American Monetary Institute and Stevens Orlando. This act was totally for the public good, not for the banks, and because of that, Kucinich was redistricted out of his Democratic seat because of this bill. Next. And it has three parts. You can't really see it. You nationalize the Federal Reserve System, bring it into the Treasury, right? Don't leave it out there doing its machinations. Stop banks creating money. The government needs to create the money. It's government money, debt-free. The banks can just do what we think they do. They can just have a pile of money and loan it out, not create it, and spend sovereign money issued by our treasury, debt-free, into the economy. Next. That's it.
Very good. So now we're gonna get Dan on our screen. So I need the HDMI cable.
Hello.
Hold on, Dan.
Okay.
Okay.
We ready?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. I shut down everything on my computer that was not Zoom because I was getting some garble. So I hope we don't get too much garble into your recording. I wanted to say, first of all, since we are at the Henry George School, and since I'm the president of the Council of Georgist Organizations, I will talk somewhat. And beyond that, I think I will start with some areas of agreement. This is pretty much in the order that things came up. The Austrian first, Austrian ecology that the world ran on barter before there was money. And what the world ran on was informal credit. It wasn't like if you wanted some potatoes and I wanted chicken, you had to have a chicken so that I could. That was never the way it worked.
Dan, could you pause for a second? Could you pause for a second?
Sure.
Okay.
Are you having transmission problems?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead now.
Okay. Let's see. The money was originated to collect taxes. The Sumerians created the first known money, and it was denominated in grains of rice, or grains of wheat rather. And the purpose was to collect taxes. There was no need for money until intertribal trade arose, and even that was primarily mutual exchanges that were more ceremonial than financial. So the original money was gold, mostly because gold and silver, mostly when international trade arose, and there was no social fabric, there was no trust. So money was always secondary to a system of order, that you had a local governing system and you had local trade that was based on credit long before there was money. The second thing I wanted to say is I agree with
with the MMT people that a balanced budget is insane. The only way we create debt-free money, and I'll explain what I mean by debt-free money in a second, because there's an argument that all money is debt money. But bank money has to be borrowed by somebody. Government can issue money and spend it. Nobody has to borrow it. So nobody is in debt to the issuer. Now, obviously, the issuer has an obligation that you can call it debt. That is, they are obligated to accept that money, to redeem that money. In the case of government, it's redeemed through payment of taxes. A large consortium of landlords could issue money because they could accept it as payment of rent. But it's not debt in the sense that you can't demand the government tax you in order to take your money. It's if they tax you, they will take your money. The debt to the Fed, this is where I agree in part. The debt to the Fed is just us issuing money. And even though Sue says the debt is privately owned, it's not privately controlled. So after the Fed pays its expenses, all of the money that it collects in interest, whether it's collecting it from banks or from the government, all that money gets sent to the Treasury. And the bank never forecloses on the government. So the debt to the Fed doesn't matter. Now, where I disagree is that the majority of the debt is owed to private bondholders. And that the Fed puts money into circulation by lending it to the government and having this fictitious debt. But the Fed takes money out of circulation by selling bonds. And when they sell bonds, the bondholders give up money in order to get the bonds. And so the process of selling bonds takes money out of circulation. And that's important to remember when we talk about inflation, because we do that to prevent inflation. One of the things that MMT people would really agree with, and I have a, you can Google it, it's called Orwellian economics, and there are all these euphemisms there are euphemisms for economic terms. One is spend versus exchange. You don't spend money. You know, when a candle is spent, there's no more candle. When a barrel of oil is spent, that barrel of oil does not exist anymore. But when a dollar is spent, somebody else has it. There's still as many dollars as there ever was. And so one thing that is important for us to remember is that you don't spend money, you exchange money. And so within the system, if there's a certain amount of money, no matter how much it's spent, it's really the same amount of money that's there. There's no such thing as borrowing from the future, and that's something Henry George put together in Social Problems. He has a chapter called Public Debts and Indirect Taxation. And he says it's ridiculous to say you're borrowing from the future. You have no power to borrow from the future. The future doesn't exist. What you're doing when you sell bonds is that you're promising the people who are rich enough that you could have taxed them, that you not only will not tax them, but that their grandchildren will be able to collect money from your grandchildren. So he's got very good stuff on public debts. One thing where he agreed with Adam Smith is that money is not wealth. That when you double the supply of money, you're having real wealth is produced by labor. It's the goods that, you know, when we say inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, the goods are wealth, and the money that chases them is a claim to wealth, and it's a very important claim to wealth. We talk about investing for acquiring, and this has to do with inflation. If we create more money and people genuinely invest, which means initial product offerings, it means putting money into a company or corporation or even a private person in order to produce more wealth, that's actually investing. When you bid up the price of stocks, you're just acquiring. and acquiring is inflationary. When you bid up the price of land, you're just acquiring, and that's inflationary. And one of the things that MMT people have to come to grips with is the role of land speculation in creating inflation. All these boom-bust cycles we've had an inflationary period, not because government created money, but because banks created money. And that bank created money increased in purchasing power, and we had inflation that showed up not immediately in the consumer price index, because land is not a consumer price index item, although housing is. But the price of land goes up when the increase in money supply, because it's a safe place to invest. We tax, the idea that we tax first and then spend is actually true historically, because our original money, we didn't create our original money. So the US government accepted for taxes, they accepted gold, they accepted foreign currency, they accepted wampum, and Connecticut people were famous for flooding the market with cheap wampum and paying taxes with it, and creating real problems. But I agree with MMT that government should create money, and that all money should be created. If all money is created by government, government doesn't tax away your money until it has spent it into circulation so you can get it in the first place. When banks create the money, however, the government is taxing that. Now, there's a myth that that's not really money because the bank demands legal tender for its taxes, and that's not really true because the government has bank accounts as well, and the legal tender is only demanded when the Federal Reserve minimums are exceeded. If I wanted to steelman MMT, I would use Warren Mosler. I think Warren Mosler is by far the most responsible and measured and thoughtful person in the MMT community, and he does not what I would call pander to the grandiose desires. If I wanted to strawman MMT, there are different people. J.D. Alt tends to do this. Randall Ray does it a little less. Ellen Brown, who I don't know that she's endorsed by MMT, but she claims to be an MMT person. She claimed that we could give everybody $1,000 a month from MMT. Well, the entire federal budget is $1,000 a month. So we would be doubling the federal budget just by printing new money. And that's just not possible. You can't do that without inflation. Henry George noted that bank money contracts when it's most needed. That's what we saw in 2008. Bank money, we had deflation in 2009 for the same reason that we had a crisis in 2008, which is that the banks stopped creating money and lending it into circulation. So as they were taking money back out of circulation, as old loans were paid, the money supply shrank. And the prescription of MMT would have been perfect for that moment, with or without banking regulation, because the banks weren't creating any money anyhow, or weren't creating nearly enough to make up for what they were taking out. So at that time, MMT policy is great. The problem is once the recovery comes and the banks start lending again, MMT makes them lend even more. They will lend because they know that you can pay them back. Now the question of production versus inflation. If the new money buys real estate, it will create inflation. If it encourages bidding up stock prices, it will cause inflation. But even if it leads to increased production, there can be a lag time, and it can, the demand response of money is instant. The production increase is delayed. So I've heard people say, well, you can use MMT to redo the public infrastructure, and then once the public infrastructure is done, people will build new factories along that infrastructure and stuff. Well, you got several years to build the infrastructure, you got a couple of years to build the factories, then they just begin to come online. So you have 4 or 5 years where that money is increased, but is not leading to increased production and increased jobs. So it ends up having that immediate inflationary problem. In the long run, you can increase the money supply if you are increasing inflation. And there are other policies like what Henry George said, shifting the tax to land and resource consumption that will do that. If you want to minimize that land lag time and you issue new money, I would suggest putting that new money into circulation by supplanting payroll taxes. So here's new money we're going to put into circulation, however much we deem as appropriate to create minimal inflation, but we want to increase productivity at the same time so that it's not more money chasing too few goods, it's more money chasing more goods. And the fastest way to get more goods is to replace these payroll taxes, because how does an employer maximize the benefit of this new money? Well, by hiring more people. The more people he hires, either he can pay them less because their payroll taxes mean they're getting the same anyhow. Their lower payroll taxes mean their net pay is the same. So he can offer jobs at a slightly lower rate and the worker's still ending up with as much money. Or if we take away the employer's contribution to Social Security, then the more he hires people, the better he is. And that is a relatively quick turnaround thing. So if you want to have MMT work in its maximal benefit, you need to focus on the quick turnaround and the quick increase in the production of goods, rather than things like, forgiving student debt is not going to lead to increased productivity for a long time, if at all. And finally, the moral principle behind the Greenbacker movement and the Chicago Plan movement is that the people who produce wealth are the people who are entitled to the benefit of new money, because the new money has value because of the people producing wealth. And it's immoral that we're taxing the people who produce wealth while we are allowing banks to create money. The banks are not producing wealth. Why do they get the benefit of creating money the value of that money was created by the wealth producers while we're taxing the wealth producers? So, and so is the value of land. And Henry George wanted to tax the value of land instead of taxing the wealth producers, because the value of land was being usurped by land speculating institutions and land monopolists, and that value was created by the producers. Well, the same thing is true with banks usurping the value of money that is created by the producers. So there is a moral basis to the idea of the Greenback movement or the Chicago Plan, which is that, yes, government should create the money, and they should create whatever amount of money it takes to keep a price stability. And it should levy its taxes and do things that increase productivity, which is what the MMT people want to see, a more productive society. But you have to do other things as well as monetary reform to make that happen. You can't just say, we're going to increase the money supply and people will be productive with it, because under the current rules, we have a history of them not being productive with it. And finally, 3 people to look up. They're on my website, savingcommunities.org. Benjamin Butler, Terrence Powderly, and Paul Douglas. And if you go to savingcommunities.org/docs, Benjamin Butler and Terrence Powderly were leading proponents of the Greenbacker movement, and Paul Douglas is the leading proponent of the Chicago plan. And they were basically MMT plus curtailing the banks. So my only problem with MMT is it is insufficiently curtailing the banks, and it thinks we can issue lots and lots of money without curtailing the banks. And our version is, yes, we can issue lots and lots of money if we curtail the banks. So there's a right amount of money to issue, and that changes constantly. So I'm not going to suggest that it's an actual amount. But whatever the right amount of money to issue is, for every dollar we take away from the bank's ability to issue money and lend it into circulation, we can add a dollar to that right amount. And then as productivity increases, because debt-free money is more productive, I agree with MMT about this, debt-free money is more productive than bank-created money in most cases. That X will also increase. So we can create X amount of money plus the productivity increase that issuing money better increases, plus $1 for every dollar we take away from the banks. One of the reasons bank money does not lead to productivity is that it is primarily mortgage money, and mortgage money is what bids up the price of land. So real estate people will tell you every time, for every point that the mortgage rate goes down, the prime rate dictates the mortgage rate, and for every point that it goes down, real estate prices go up by a certain percentage. And so there's a very direct correlation, far more direct. It's like just issuing money in general, which is what MMT wants to do, has a smaller correlation to this, but mortgage money has a huge correlation to inflating the price of real estate. And when you inflate the price of real estate, you attract investors who will buy real estate instead of investing in a factory or something and producing wealth. That there's productive investment and speculative investment. And that's something I want to see the MMT people tackle more aggressively. That's it from me.
Okay, so thanks for listening. Is it down on? It's on. It's turned on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So clarification points, please keep it brief. I want to give these guys a little time to maybe do a little rebuttal if they wish to the other speakers, and then we'll go into bigger discussions, okay? So quick questions of clarification.
Here's the mic.
When I think it was Sue was speaking, she spoke of the Federal Reserve banks, particularly, well, I guess all 12 of them, but you referenced the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and you stated quite correctly that it's privately owned by the member banks of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And then you made a jump and said, and therefore, and you said they control the Federal Reserve Bank. I admit that they are the shareholders, they can vote, they can elect directors, but I don't think you demonstrated that they actually, in a substantive sense, control the Federal Reserve Bank. And if you review the Federal Reserve Act, I think of 1913, I think you find that their ability to control is quite limited.
Well, do you want me to say something? If you go back into history and you read the history, they're very powerful, the Federal Reserve. We know that.
You're talking about the banks that were the members.
Yeah.
Control.
Yeah, I know, but I'm talking about the Federal Reserve itself. So you have a board, which doesn't create money, it's just, the board is part of the government. But you know, I was saying that to one group, and another monetary reformer said that the salaries of the board are paid for by the Federal Reserve banks. Now, that would be something someone could research. You know, I thought they were paid for by the government because I thought they were part of the government, but the banks themselves, what are the functions of the banks? They clear checks. They're the payment system, right? All the checks get cleared and the money gets distributed. But the more powerful function is done within the Federal Reserve by the member banks. So for instance, those 20 primary dealer banks of the New York Fed. Now, those 20 primary dealer banks have two separate functions, but the same banks do it in the New York Fed. The one is, they are the ones that buy our Treasury bonds at auction. When the Treasury does its auction to the world, it goes through those 20 primary dealer banks. And they might not, some of the bonds they might put on their own balance sheet, you know, they create the money, put it on their own balance sheet, the bonds. Some of them they sell out to people out around the world making big fees. That's a big power. That's a big power, those 20 banks. It's the banks that have that power, right? They're all members of the Fed. They're all multinational banks. What's the second function they have? They're part of, those primary dealers do another function, which is, the New York Fed has something inside of it called the Open Market Committee. Okay, so the 7 people on the board of the Fed, board of governors or whatever they're called in Washington, they're on that Open Market Committee. They sit around a big table, and then all the presidents of the 12 Federal Reserve banks are on the Open Market Committee. And those primary dealers are used because the Federal Reserve itself is a corporation. It has a balance sheet, right? It has securities that it owns as assets, right? And it has the reserves of all its member banks that it owes to its member banks, right? So there's the assets and there's the liabilities. And the Federal Reserve, that Open Market Committee is going to make these decisions. It's going to decide, oh, we should buy more securities from out there in the economy and create reserves and send it out into the economy. It's creating reserves. Something to be very, very, very important to understand about this financial system. And it's very confusing when you read about it. You have the 12 Federal Reserve banks. They create reserves. What's reserves? That's not the money any of us use. It's not, doesn't circulate around our economy, in and out of our checking accounts, in and out of retail stores. No, it just circulates around the 12 Federal Reserve banks. And it's owned by their member banks, by the banks. Banks, that's the little world of the Federal Reserve. They create those reserves. QE, what was QE? QE was the Federal Reserve banks creating reserves, not the money we use. They create reserves. And they gave it to the banks by buying their mortgage-backed securities that were practically 30% on the dollar. They saved the banks by creating reserves and giving it to the banks. The banks need reserves. We don't use reserves. We can't. Not one penny of reserves do we use in the economy. So that's the world of the Fed. But over here is our world. We use the money the bank creates when they make loans or buy securities. That's our money. So those primary dealers, they're the ones that when the Federal Reserve says, I'm gonna buy securities, or I'm gonna sell some securities that are on my balance sheet, in and out of our economy, those primary dealers are the ones that they do those trades with. So it's the primary dealers in the Federal Reserve System. Those are banks, corporations, privately run corporations, members of the bank. Very powerful. That's why I say, you know, who's running the show?
Yeah. I'd like to suggest that we get down at a lot of monetary reformers get down in the weeds about whether the Federal Reserve is privately owned.
Dan, can we let Adam has a response and then we'll come back to you? Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay. So I'll tell you the MMT position on that is that all the banks are subordinates of Congress, basically. They're agents of Congress. They're regulated by Congress. Yes, they're private, they're powerful, all that. But at the end of the day, they're regulated by Congress. Quantitative easing, yes, the government injected bank reserves, but that was all just monetary policy. That's literally how our payment system operates. So injecting reserves saved the banks in a sense, but it saved the whole financial system, really, because the goal was to reduce interest rates, and that's what the government was doing. It was policy that didn't work. It wasn't policy like just to serve the banks, basically.
Okay, Dan wants to speak, and then we'll go to the next question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that whether the Federal Reserve is privately owned is not completely irrelevant, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as people think it does. The Bank of England is entirely owned by the Crown. It's a totally nationalized bank and has been since 1948. And they do exactly the same thing that we do. So the real question is who has the political control? And Sue is right that the national banks have a huge political influence, and so do the commercial banks of England, so that 95% of our money is bank created, of our circulating money is bank created money. Well, 97% of England's money is bank created money. So I don't want to get too far down into the weeds of how the Federal Reserve was created. It was created to look like it was more private than it was in 1913 because people were insisting that the government could not create money, which is not true, but people believed it at the time. So they wanted it to look private. And over time, they have made it generally less private, but politically, it is still privately controlled. The money that the member banks get on their stock holdings is 6% on their original investment, and that's 6% of the profit. So even if they have to pay for the Federal Reserve officers, that's deducted from the profits, and they still get their 6%. It's a weird, arbitrary thing, but the 6% is not important. What's important is that politically, our presidents have always appointed people to the Federal Reserve who had the stamp of approval of the national bank leaders. That's not written into law. That's just the political dominance of our banking system. So I don't think it matters too much. What does matter is that the commercial banks have had such a free rein that they can create way too much money and lend it into circulation.
Okay, we have a couple questions. I think you were the first.
Who was the first?
Yeah, so really quickly, could you go over the process for quantitative easing?
Yeah.
I'm assuming it's just selling treasury bonds and then injecting them into just adding more reserves?
Yeah.
And how does that actually increase, how does that actually save anything?
So basically, what quantitative easing did was the government wanted banks to lower interest rates. How that actually happens in the financial system is by changing reserve balances in the banking system, right? So what the banks did was they exchanged securities on their balance sheets for reserves from the Fed. So the excess reserves in the in the reserve system, which is just like a payments clearing system. It's how the banks exchange funds with one another. The excess reserves that the government put into the system dropped interest rates. That's like purely the mechanism they use to control the rates.
So it was purely just decreasing interest rates?
Yeah.
That was the whole.
Yeah, yeah. And that money doesn't.
It wasn't the first. Was that the first thing they've ever used it, or
I think it had been done in England before. It's unconventional monetary policy, but it's just it's literally just how they lowered interest rates at the time.
I see.
Yep.
And I guess I'm assuming it's lowering it to a greater extent than they usually do, because they're always changing the overnight rate or whatever.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, next to you.
You know, this is a rather fascinating discussion you all have in here, and I have multiple questions. I recently watched C-SPAN, and I saw Naomi Prince. She wrote books, and she was an analyst over at Goldman Sachs, and she wrote books about the collusion and also the president's bankers, which started with the Theodore Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan. Are you familiar with her writings? Any of you? You're not.
I haven't read her, but I know.
I recommend at least get to know her stuff. I have a lot of questions. You spoke about beginnings of money I forget the name of the ancient area you were talking about. What was it?
Sumer didn't?
Sumerian? Is that what you said, Sumerian?
Well, wherever there was a civilization arising, there was a need for
Okay,
money.
so you use Sumerian, but I suppose in the East, in China and in India, they had something similar, or they had a totally different economic system.
I haven't studied them. I only know that
Okay.
they were the first to issue
All right,
paper.
you don't have to go any further than that, that's okay. Now, I understand something about SDRs. These are special drawing rights. The United States government is a world reserve currency, and we have, I believe, at now 40% of the total kitty of SDRs. And then there's some other countries that make it up, and I think China, for the first time recently, became paper money that we had changed the $100 bill into something else. And I understand that our American money, a lot of it is counterfeit. And I believe I've been hearing this is wrong, you can tell me. North Korea has been responsible for printing, before we changed the money, I guess, printing out $100 bills and whatnot and circulating it into the marketplace. I mean, I don't know if any of this is true. This is what I've heard. I would like clarification on that. And I'd like to know, I'm sorry, and I'd like to know also if the world reserve currency that the dollar has, this position that it has, if it was to go away and some other currency got stronger, maybe China or maybe the euro will become the world reserve currency, how does that affect us here as citizens? And will we have inflation, or what will we do? I mean, I have a lot of questions.
Okay, yeah. So, you want to explain what special drawing rights are?
Any other question?
Well, that's the response to some of that.
Okay.
You want to respond first, or
Well, the main thing is that being the world's reserve currency does mean that we have to be more careful about inflation, because if we get a reputation for having a weaker dollar, that prices are going up in terms of American dollars more than they're going up in terms of Chinese yuan or Japanese yen or euros or whatever. If we get that reputation, foreign money will come flooding back into the United States. Now, we don't usually, when we measure inflation with our consumer price index, we ignore what's happening to money in Samoa or what. We basically say, what are prices like in the United States? But if foreign people stop accepting American dollars and start dumping American dollars by, buying our stuff, which is good, but they're sending our dollars back here, then we have to stop issuing our MMT. We have to stop our MMT policy and cut it short, because this foreign money is coming in, and we have to prevent the inflation that comes from other countries dumping. Canada doesn't have that problem. The Canadian dollar is basically used in Canada. So if they engaged in MMT and it began to get inflationary, they can very easily scale back and the problem is solved. But if we get to a point where we trigger some kind of fearful reaction, even after we scale back, that fearful reaction can continue to increase the money supply, and we can have a greater inflation problem than Canada would have or Mexico would have. Or most countries, their dollars are internally used, and they have far less of a danger than we have.
So in front of the previous questioner, and then in front of him, I think, and then I went back to there. The Yi did, or Ron?
No, that's Ron. Ron first. Okay, let's go.
Ron and then.
No, here. Let's go. Guys, let's make it brief.
Okay, I'm going to make my question brief, but kind of reference, I think both AMI and MMT people would have agreed with my mother. My mother taught me that money doesn't grow on trees. So my question, where you guys disagree, it seems to me, is who controls this money tree? Where does the money grow? And I see it's at the heart of disagreement, because from MMT, you seem to be saying the money tree is controlled by the government. It's the government that prints, creates the money, puts it out into circulation. And it seems that AMT says, AMI is saying, basically, it's the private banks that essentially control the money tree. It's the private banks, not the government, that puts almost all that money into circulation. And I would like, if possible, if 3 or 4 of you could just discuss this point for just a couple of minutes, and you can present your arguments in that area for the money tree.
Yeah. So I would say the government's the only entity that can create high-powered money, which is U.S. dollars, without debt attached to it. I think most people in MMT, again, MMT is descriptive, so MMT describes the system. It's not saying it should be this way, it should be that way. I think a lot of MMTers, I would agree that banks probably do have too much power in terms of creating money. But at the end of the day, the MMT lens, the government's the only entity that can create money without debt attached to it, high-powered money.
Yeah. And I think it's mostly a matter of emphasis, but we don't think that there's much of a difference between high-powered money and low-powered money. If you have a bank account and you have money in the bank, you don't know how much of that came from government and how much of it was created by somebody else's loan or whatever. The problem is that bank-created money and government-created money are so totally intermingled that to the whole economy, money is money, and you don't know whether your dollar bank money has the same amount of power as your dollar government-created money. Once you deposit that government money in bank, it's no different to you as a consumer or as a producer how that money originated. All that money has the same power once it's in circulation. Now the difference is that every time there's a recession, the bank-created money will dry up. And if we did what MMT wanted to do at precisely the right time, which was 2008 when it collapsed, if instead of bailing out the banks through lowered interest rates, suppose we had given every citizen, at the time, since we had negative inflation, we could have done this. If we had given every citizen $1,000, the people who had to make a mortgage payment would make a mortgage payment with that, and the other people would be spending their money and improving business so that people could earn the money to make the mortgage payment. You know, the only reason the bank failed is because the public failed. The people, instead of finessing it so banks could have more money to lend us, we would have solved that crisis without a bank bailout.
So back to, okay, Jim. Sue? All right, Sue and then Jim.
Yeah, I want to answer that. You know, this gets into the weeds. I'm going to try not to get into the weeds. But I worked for 16 years for a multinational bank here in New York. And in my career, which was 30 years long, for some reason, I never studied bookkeeping. I never did, I never studied economics. But for some reason, whenever I went to a new financial institution, they gave me the bookkeeping system. I think because I'm very focused on details, you know. And what I learned, and I learned this at the bank, because the bank, what is the bank? The first day I went into the bank, I said, I gotta look at the files. What's here? Debits and credits. That's what a bank is. Money is debits and credits in and out of accounts. You look at your bank statement, it says it's debiting here and then it's crediting here, and your money's going up and down. That's what money is today in this world. It's you know, back in the Middle Ages, money was debit here, credit here, in and out of accounts. It's all done by computers now. But you can get a report, you get your, I always request a physical statement, and I can see the debits in my bank account, I can see the credits, and there's the balance at the bottom. That's what it is. So, you have to keep in mind that the 12 Federal Reserve banks, the only kind of money, nature of money, that's in their accounts is reserves. We can't touch it. It's only money that moves in and out between banks. That special corporation that has the power to create money. They are the only ones that are allowed, plus the Treasury account at the New York Fed, right? Because the Fed was, when it was created, that Treasury account was put in the New York Fed. There are reserves in the Treasury account, because only reserves are found in those 12 Federal Reserve banks. In our banks, Citibank, Chase, TD, Banking Act, those are our bank money. That's all that money is created by private corporations called banks that have the special power because it was in the Federal Reserve law. I would say, as a historical aside, Woodrow Wilson, who signed that law, publicly said he regretted signing it later when he saw what was going on with the banks. Anyway, so don't get confused with all the reserves, because that's not what we use. Our bank money, what was your question about?
Basically, who's creating our money?
Yeah, our money that we have in our accounts is all bank money. The two systems never mesh. Oh, I know what, I want to give an example of what happens when I pay my taxes to the federal government. I write a check, that's bank money. I send it to the IRS. The IRS picks up my check and deposits it in the Treasury account, right? So the money, that bank money disappears from my account, but remember, that bank money doesn't go into the Fed. Bank money's only out here, what we all use. What goes into that Treasury account at the New York Fed is my bank's reserves. So I have a TD account. I pay my tax, $100. My account balance goes down of bank money, $100. TD Bank has an account at the New York Fed. Its reserve, that's their special money, right? Goes down $100, and it's debited from TD's reserve account. This debits and credits, that's bookkeeping. And it comes over here and it gets credited in the Treasury account at the New York Fed. It's a special account. The New York Fed is supposed to take care of our government and be the fiscal agent of the Treasury. That means it helps it move its reserves around and spend its money. But it's okay.
So they
That's,
communicate.
The short answer is the cash in your wallet and the coins in your pocket were created by government, and all the other money was created by banks, by commercial banks. The cash in your wallet was created by the Fed, but we consider that to be more government. You know, it's not entirely private, it's not entirely public, but essentially the cash in your pocket is close enough to government-created money that we consider it. And the 95% that's created by commercial banks is all in accounts. It's not cash in your pocket.
Do you want to respond or next question?
What I'd like to recommend is if we take, let's say, 3 questions from people who have not already asked questions, and then the speakers can respond as a group to them. And at a certain point, I also would like some rebuttal time for the other, with regard to the other people on the panel.
Yeah.
But let's
Okay.
take a series of questions and.
Okay, let's do that.
All right,
So we've got one there,
And then, yeah.
there's one up here.
Actually, make it easy, you have the mic, talk.
We're going
Actually, I have a specific
Look,
question.
it was okay.
What's the, do you know in colonial time, what happens to the government, the state government, the colonial government, they collect tax, what after that? Do you know what happened to that money?
Oh, well, the colonies
Yeah.
issued, the colonial legislatures issued the paper money, they called it scrip. It's certain, they spent it on,
No, I'm talking about after they collect those paper money.
taxes.
What happens, do you know what happens after?
It differed. Usually they would spend it out again.
No, I'm telling you, because those money will be destroyed. That's the theory, that's the MMT theory of the credit theory of money. So basically, the colonial government will collect the money as tax, and then when they collect tax, they will destroy those ledgers, notes. So
That's federal money, not state money.
well,
Federal government issues
that's
and
colonial
destroys.
funds.
The state money.
Okay, so the point is, when the Federal Reserve banks nowadays they are doing the quantitative tightening. So what they do is when they tightening the money supply, it's.
I want to make one point about government. Government is also a private corporation, okay? And the last thing they want is like 1,000 politicians, the political class, okay, who are so easily bought and corrupted by the private institutions to be issuing the money. So there is a conceptual thing that we have to work a little bit more. What do we mean by government or public versus private? I mean, on the institutional level, how is that going to be actuated is like really, really important, and it's not clear yet. The last thing I was going to say is, when we say that we print money, like the MMT, like print money and give to the people, why give it? Like, you have to do something to get the money. Usually it's like you do labor, like you have a production, so you are in debt. That goes back to Dan's comment. You are indebted. You pledge your labor, your productivity, and you get money. So there's always some debt involved with any kind of money. And how we're going to decide whose labor is worth at what, and then let's give them that money for doing that work. You know, that is.
Okay. So let's go to next to you. We'll try to get some responses.
I don't think it's on, but.
Put it on, to have a system.
Or do I have this? Okay. So, to the MMT folks, you said that high-powered money is the only debt-free money out in circulation, I think. Am I getting you correctly, personnel? Earlier, high-powered.
So how would you
because I'll just finish it because isn't that deficit spending, isn't that tied to bonds? And I mean, we could change the law and decouple it from bonds, but at the moment, and for the last whatever 200 years or what have you, it has been coupled to bonds. So in effect, the money supply is not changed, it's just the liquidity has changed.
Yeah,
So-
I would agree with that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so that's three, and he has one too, and there are more, but shall we just give a couple of responses?
Yeah.
There you go, okay.
Yes, thank you. Yes,
thank you. So I wanted to ask in regard to 29 and then also 2008 for recovery for both of these financial collapses. So you indicated that if money had gone to actual consumers, that it could have kept the real economy alive because it would have been circulating. The velocity of money would have kept things going. Now, in 1929, was can you comment on these two things based on that, and then based on like the recovery time it took for the financial collapse in 1929, and then also about how gradually all those Roosevelt initiatives that were put in there to help build up the economy, a lot of them were just taken away, like the laws were repealed, things like that. So do you have any comments related to that?
I would say that, 1929 was worse partly because the bubble was worse. And the bubble was worse partly because we were on the gold standard until 1925. And if you look at everybody went off the gold standard during the Great Depression. Sweden went off first, and they were the first to recover. We had, going off the gold standard doesn't save you from the damage that was already done, but the gold has a deflationary effect in that unless banks are creating lots and lots of money, and unless there's great prosperity, what will happen is when times get tight and the economy is not doing well, people will run with their dollars and demand gold. And there has never been enough gold to maintain a gold standard, except in places that were big gold exporters like South Africa, and Canada got away with it for a little while. But the advantage we have now is that we put money into circulation, and so did Roosevelt. And the people who say Roosevelt actually prolonged the Depression don't look much at the infusion of money into the economy. They look at the programs and say, this was a stupid program, it didn't produce any wealth, it's all these poor people marching around on these civilian conservation projects. They're not producing wealth. And that's a legitimate criticism, and it's kind of a criticism that I have of a lot of proposals that are linked to MMT that are not actually MMT. Banks start taking money out of circulation, which they did starting in 1925, and the dam broke in 29, and which is what they did from 2005 to 2008. That the idea of putting money directly into circulation, which is what both we and MMT want to do, that is absolutely the best way to curb a recession.
There's a question here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, can we go to Jim now?
I don't need a mic. During the presidential elections in 2000.
No, I'm not going to take this question because we asked for several people to pose questions and then
we're
have
trying
the
to
panelists
respond.
respond.
To respond now.
So I'm not going to address all the questions that in this set of questions. I will say, yes, I agree it is important that when we look at the monetary policies of the American colonies, the important thing to recognize is that the paper currency that they issued had value because those colonies accepted that paper money back in payment of taxation. Well, we can get very hung up on the term debt. I sometimes think that it's better to use the term obligation, mutual obligation, right? The the taxpayer has the obligation to pay taxes in the currency that the government has issued. The government has the responsibility, the obligation to accept that. And when that happens, they basically extinguish their mutual obligations. And if you keep that in mind, then whenever you're looking at money or debt or anything like that, you're always going to say, what are the mutual obligations? I find that that's very helpful. The gentleman who said, well, government is also a private corporation, and I don't trust the politicians. Well, that's a matter of personal faith or opinion, or and there are lots of times when I don't trust politicians and so forth. If your position is that the government can only do wrong, and therefore we shouldn't bother to worry about what the government's policy is, then policies that might be derived from modern monetary theory or monetary reform theory or anything else don't matter, because the government is always going to screw it up. For the record, most of the main advocates of modern monetary theory, they would say that government is a good thing, and that the government ought to serve the public purpose. I agree with that. And the last point I'm going to say about this is the person who said if the government were distributing all this money, well, you have to do something to get this money. Yes, if for example, as a result, if the government were following a policy, well, the policy above all else that MMT recommends is the job guarantee. If the federal government were guaranteeing a job at a socially acceptable minimum wage to anyone who wants and is able to work, that would be a foundation of economic policy. It would expect the people to work, right? The people were expected to work if they were working for the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. This is where you might also have heard of a program called the Universal Basic Income. This is very different from the job guarantee. And the Universal Basic Income is not consistent with the approach taken to the economy by modern monetary theory, because there's no work requirement involved. And hence there's the mutual obligations are not there. However, that being said, remember that as Adam started out, MMT is primarily a description of the way that our capitalist economy with a currency, with a fiat currency, is currently working. And there are certain policy recommendations that derive from that. There are other policy recommendations that MMT advocates share, but do not necessarily strictly come from MMT. And in later remarks, I'll mention a few of them. So it's important when people are talking about MMT to say MMT will do this or MMT will do that. It's important to understand that maybe you're putting words or policies into MMT people's mouths. That's important to consider.
I'm always putting words into MMT people's mouths that I heard came out of their mouths.
Sue.
Yeah, I just want to say something about the 1929 crash. I just want to mention that there was a Great Depression in our farming communities in 1920-21, caused by the Federal Reserve. And you can go, a reporter back then got the recording of the Federal Reserve Committee, governors, and put it into the congressional record. It's in the congressional record. It was caused by these governors saying, well, there's too much debt around, let's tell the banks, call in the loans, don't make any more loans, and the farmers got really shut down. But 1929 is interesting because what was going on before 1929? We had a new bank loan called a margin loan. That was brand new, right? The banks were creating money so that people could buy stock. That's what the bubble came from. And it was brand new, that margin loan. And it worked great, right, until the crash. The other thing that was going on right before the crash in the 20s was big real estate bubble in different places around our country. Again, bank loans, the power of the banks to create that money, give it to people, prices go up. So what happened in 1929, you know, you have to read the history, which you can't find in our schools. You know, the two men at the creation of the Fed, the two financial men with the most power, well, Paul Warburg, he became a governor of the first Federal Reserve, 1914, it went into operation. He was one of the governors on the committee. And Benjamin Strong, who was a pretty young guy, he was the first president of the New York Fed. They understood the system. The other bankers didn't really quite understand it because it was new. A central bank, they came from Europe. American bankers didn't really know. We hadn't had a central bank since Jackson refused to recharter it, right? So these two guys knew. So what happened, and this is unfortunate in our history, 1928, Benjamin Strong died. It was not expected. He died. The people who were left on the board really didn't know how the system really worked. And historians have said, if Benjamin Strong had lived, he knew how the open market committee would work. He would have shot money out into the economy using that open market committee by buying securities from the banks and people and everything and get money out there. Money was disappearing. But unfortunately, he died. So you have the crash because there's not enough money. You know, the people can't pay their margin loans. The whole thing collapses. Now, that's 1929. From 1929 to 1933, you can see the increase in the bankruptcies of banks. It was just, now when a bank goes bankrupt, the money disappears. So our money supply that we all depend on, created by these banks, was slowly shrinking. You know, there wasn't overproduction of food in the Depression. It was people didn't have money to buy it. That was the problem. And thank God, thank God that the Fed in 2008 created, using their power, you know, the open market committee and everything, created $16 trillion of low interest loans and shot them around the world because the world economy was crashing down, you know? Anyway, okay.
Okay. More questions? Okay.
Well, you know, I have a lot of questions, but what the heck, you know, this is an informal meeting, so why not? You know, during the presidential election, Hillary Clinton used to debate and talk about shadow banking. Now, I want to get an understanding of what shadow banking is. And before you answer that, I want to give you what I think shadow banking is. It's like loan sharking, that's what I think. So, after the financial crisis in 2008, the TARP money came in, propped up the banks, they changed the rules, they deregulated, they made tighter regulations, and the money was dried up because they couldn't lend. So the shadow banks come in and take over. They form a new entity. The major banks give them a line of credit, and then they go out and redistribute that money at higher interest rates than normal. to the businesses that are struggling, that need money, is that a correct definition of what shadow banking is, or is it incorrect? And if I'm wrong, correct me.
My understanding is that large corporations like AIG created their own credit system above and beyond. They might have had some money, but their credit system was just plain old. Their credit system was not backed by the full faith in government of the United States the way commercial bank credit systems are. So shadow banking is pretty much limited to high-powered investors who are taking a risk. The shadow bank is taking a risk that the borrower, the high-powered investor, is going to turn a profit, and the investor is taking a risk that the AIG credits are going to be good. So so the shadow bank credit is not thoroughly commingled with U.S. dollars the way commercial, government licensed, Fed endorsed commercial credit is. But there is some interaction in that institutions that have commercial credit and have borrowed U.S. dollars will leverage that through shadow banking. Primarily, shadow banking is almost like an alternate currency. So if Canada is irresponsible with their money, it might affect the US dollar, but it's really going to affect the Canadian dollar. And so my inclination is to not worry about shadow banking because the full faith and credit of the United States is not behind it. And if it goes south, it really doesn't affect our money supply so much as it affects their internal little credit system.
Yeah, Jim.
Well, I would disagree that we don't have to worry about shadow banking, because actually the financial losses in the 2008-2009 financial crisis were much greater in the so-called shadow banking system than they were in the commercial banking system. One of the people that modern monetary theory looks to as an intellectual ancestor is an economist by the name of Hyman Minsky, who taught for many years at Washington University in St. Louis. And he had this apophthegm, I guess you would say: stability leads to instability. And what he meant was, and he had this picture of the evolution of the capitalist economy that involved various stages: the stage of commercial banking system, the stage of finance capital, I forget the name of the next, major corporation capital, and finally our current phase, money manager capital. And what he said is that we go through the way that the finance sector of the economy evolves is that you have a crisis, you have reforms such as were put into effect in the 1930s, and if they work, and to a considerable extent those reforms in the 1930s did work for many decades, you have stability. But banks, like all private capitalist businesses, are profit-seeking things, and so over time, people start to think, well, if we can just go around the regulation a little, we'll get more profits. Does anybody here remember the name Walter Wriston? Walter Wriston. Wriston, W-R-I-S-T-O-N. He was the chairman of Citibank in the 1970s and 1980s, and was the guy who thought up the idea of these bank holding companies in which the other subsidiaries of the bank diversified into all these other activities. That was, the genesis of shadow banking. And he was the person who led the way to undermine the Glass-Steagall Act, the major act of financial reform from the New Deal. And so we had this, and the reforms were chipped away, and as you may recall, the Glass-Steagall Act was abolished during the Clinton administration, and subsequently, as someone here mentioned, the regulation that had been put into place in the 1930s was undermined by the time it came to 2008. And basically, what Minsky and many MMT people found, we believe in very strong banking reform and regulation. But we do not believe that there is a panacea that will last forever, because the dynamic of the capitalist system is that, because it is a profit-seeking system, that there are always going to be people who are going to say, well, we don't need those regulations anymore because we've been stable for so long. Hyman Minsky said, no, stability leads to instability. MMTers have a lot of very sharp criticisms of the banking system. I have slides I won't have time to show here today that show you how we would impose reforms on the banking system. So I'll stop there.
So could you comment also on what I'm about to mention some facts about, and I'd just be curious to hear what your comments on them are. Well, for instance, from what I understand, the OTC, that where they trade outside of the market and it's out of the regulatory view of all the regulatory agencies, there's multiples of up to 6 to 10 times what's happening in the real economy. It's it almost seems like the real economy is just producing gambling chips for the OTC. And this is serious. This is the financial business taking over the economy, and you can see it. Manufacturing has gone down. There's a descension on the curve, and there's an uprising in financial. Financial industry has increased 15-20% in the last 20-30 years. So do you have any comments on that, in the coming rentier? Is there a rentier society that's taking place here?
Addressing that again?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I would say that all this Glass-Steagall stuff is relevant because banks are creating money and lending it into circulation. So if they create subsidiaries and then lend money to their own subsidiaries, well, that's an abuse of something that was abusive to begin with. So it's kind of a compound abuse. But if they're not creating any money, if they're only lending at their own risk, or they're lending at the depositor's risk, and the depositors end up, you still need some regulation against fraud, but you don't have to micromanage how banks make loans if they are not, if they don't have the excessive privilege of creating money out of thin air and lending it into circulation. They're creating money that is rightfully our money because we created the wealth that gives that money value. So, once you give them that privilege, they're going to milk that privilege for all it's worth. And Minsky is right within that context. But we are thinking outside of that box and saying, well, if banks couldn't create the money in the first place, they couldn't create credit out of thin air and lend it to people unless that credit was completely divorced from our monetary system. That my deposits if I have money in your bank, I'm not going to have free checking. I'm going to have to pay you a fee in order to have a checking account in your bank because you're not allowed to lend that money. The fact that it's an on-demand account, and I can take that money